The colony world of Hearth's Edge had never been kind to anyone, but it had been especially unkind to Dane Ashworth. He had come to the frontier planet 3 years earlier with a resettlement contract and a promise of fertile lands, only to find that the terraforming grids had failed a full growing season before his arrival. The soil was gray and cracked, the rivers ran thin and mineral bitter. Half the original settlers had already taken the last transport ship back toward the core worlds, and the other half were too stubborn, too poor, or too broken to leave. Dane was all three. He lived alone at the edge of Hollow Ridge, in a prefabricated shelter patched with scavenged hull plating from a crashed supply freighter. His rations came once a month from the colonial depot, thin gray bricks of nutrient bread that tasted like ash and duty. By the third week, most months, the bread ran out. By the fourth week, Dane simply didn't eat. He had grown used to hunger the way a man grows used to a chronic ache, not comfortable with it, but no longer surprised by it either. It was on one such fourth week, with a single heel of bread left in his coat pocket, and 2 days remaining before the next supply drop, that he found her. She was lying in the frost-cracked gulch below Hollow Ridge, half buried in ash-colored snow. Her body curled protectively around itself, the way wounded animals curl when they expect the next blow to come from any direction. Dane almost mistook her for wreckage. Her skin held a faint bluish undertone in the dim light, and strange plated ridges ran down her forearms like the vestigial armor of some ancient warrior lineage. It was only when she stirred and let out a low rattling breath that he understood he was looking at a person. He had heard of her kind before. The Varith Shah, a nomadic alien species from beyond the outer trade lanes, warrior-born and clan-bound, known across a dozen systems for their brutal skirmishes and their code of debts repaid in blood or in kind. He had never seen one up close. He had certainly never expected to find one starving in a ditch on a half-dead colony world, abandoned by whatever ship or war had brought her there. She looked at him with eyes the color of dying embers, and she did not beg. Varith Shah warriors, he would later learn, considered begging a shame worse than death. She only looked at him and waited to see what kind of creature he was. Dane crouched down. His hands were shaking, though he told himself it was only the cold. He had 1 piece of bread left. 2 days until resupply. A grown man could survive 2 days without eating if he had to. He had done it before. He broke the bread in half without thinking too hard about it. Because if he had thought about it, really thought about what it meant to give away his last meal to a stranger, an alien, an enemy soldier for all he knew, he might have talked himself out of it. He held out the larger half. She stared at his offered hand for a long moment, as if trying to detect the trick in it. Then slowly, she reached out with a clawed and trembling hand and took the bread. She did not thank him. Her kind did not seem to have a word for it, not the way his people meant it. But she looked at him, really looked. The way you look at someone you intend to remember, and something passed between them that neither of them had language for yet. He helped her back to his shelter. He gave her water, and what little heat his failing generator could produce. She did not speak his language, not then, and he did not know a syllable of hers. But in the days that followed, 3 days, as it turned out, before a small unmarked shuttle descended out of the ash-colored sky to retrieve her, they built a kind of understanding out of gestures and patience, and the shared silence of 2 exhausted creatures too tired to be afraid of each other anymore. On the morning the shuttle came, she stood in the shelter's doorway and pressed something into his palm. A small carved token, bone-white, etched with symbols he didn't recognize. Then she was gone, swallowed by the ship's ramps, and Dane Ashworth was alone again on his gray and broken world, wondering if he had imagined the entire thing. He kept the token anyway. He wore it on a cord around his neck, hidden beneath his collar, and he never spoke of her to anyone at the depot, because he knew they would not believe him, and because some part of him wanted to keep her, the memory of her, entirely his own. Years passed the way they do on frontier worlds, slowly, and then all at once. The colony at Hollow Ridge did not improve. If anything, it worsened. The core world government, stretched thin by a distant war along the trade corridors, cut resupply runs to quarterly instead of monthly. Half the remaining settlers finally gave up and left. Dane stayed, not out of hope, but out of the particular stubbornness that comes from having nothing left to lose and nowhere else to be. He took up work repairing the last of the colony's failing machinery, water reclaimers, heat exchangers, the ancient tractors that still, somehow, scraped a thin harvest out of the gray soil each season. He became known, in the quiet way that frontier men become known, as someone reliable. Someone who would fix your generator in the middle of the night and not ask for payment he knew you couldn't give. He never told anyone why he had become that kind of man. He never told anyone about the bone-white token he still wore beneath his collar. Word did occasionally drift in from beyond the outer trade lanes. Fractured, unreliable news carried by supply pilots and traders who passed through Hollow Ridge on their way to somewhere better. There was a war out there, they said, among the Vareth Shah clans and the raider fleets that preyed on their territory. A civil conflict that had fractured old alliances and forged new ones. Some said a young warrior had risen among the Vareth Shah, a commander who fought with a discipline unusual for her people, who had turned the tide of 3 major clan battles before her 25th cycle. Dane never asked her name. He told himself it was foolish to wonder if the stories were about her. Space was vast, and the Vareth Shah numbered in the millions, scattered across a dozen systems. It was foolish to build a fantasy out of a few days of shared silence and a carved bone token. But at night, when the wind howled against his shelter's patched hull and the cold crept in through every seam, he found himself thinking of ember-colored eyes and wondering. He grew older. His hair silvered at the temples. His hands, once smooth, grew calloused and scarred from a decade of repair work. He never married. There had been a woman once, a fellow settler named Ilsa Roan, who had shown some interest in him during his 5th year on Hollow Ridge. But it had come to nothing, and Dane had never quite understood why he hadn't pursued it further. He told himself it was because Hollow Ridge was no place to raise a family. He did not let himself examine the other reason too closely. The colony depot finally closed in his 11th year on the planet, the government having decided that Hollow Ridge was not worth the cost of continued supply. The remaining settlers were offered evacuation. Most took it. Dane, stubborn to the last, did not. He was nearly out of food again. An old, familiar hunger, the kind he had known since his very first season on this world. When the ship came down out of the ash-colored sky, it was not a small unmarked shuttle this time. It was a warship, sleek and dark, bearing markings Dane did not recognize but somehow, on some instinctive level, understood. He stood in the doorway of his shelter and watched it land in the frost-cracked gulch below Hollow Ridge, the very same gulch where, more than a decade before, he had found a starving girl curled against the cold. The ramp descended. A single figure walked down it, tall and armored, moving with the unmistakable bearing of someone who commanded soldiers rather than followed them. It was only when she removed her helmet that Dane felt his breath catch in his chest. The ember-colored eyes had not changed. Her name, he would finally learn, was Threa Vask, and she was no longer merely a warrior of the Vareth Shah. She was Sha-Commander, a title earned through the very battles the traitors' rumors had spoken of, the highest rank a Vareth Shah warrior could achieve outside the ruling clan council itself. She had ended the civil war that had fractured her people for nearly a decade, and in doing so, had become something close to legend among the clans she now led. But she had not come to Hollow Ridge as a commander. She had come as something else entirely. She explained it to him that evening, in his small shelter, over a meal his replicator struggled to produce from its last remaining nutrient stores. The same shelter, though patched and repaired a dozen times over, where she had once taken shelter from the cold. Her standard language had improved dramatically in the years since he'd last seen her, though it still carried the clipped, deliberate cadence of someone who had learned it as a tool of diplomacy rather than a native tongue. Among the Vareth Shah, she told him, a life debt was the most sacred bond one being could hold toward another. When she had been near death in that gulch, abandoned by a raider crew that had left her for dead after a failed skirmish, Dane had given her not merely food, but the whole of what he had. His last piece of bread, with 2 days of hunger ahead of him and no guarantee of relief. Among her people, this was not a small kindness. It was the highest form of sacrifice one stranger could offer another. and it created a bond that could not be repaid with gratitude alone. It could only be repaid in kind. I searched for you, she said, the moment my war was finished. I did not know if you still lived. I did not know if this world still stood. She paused, studying him with the same careful, unreadable expression she had worn all those years ago, when she'd first decided he was not a threat. I am Sha-Commander now. I could have sent gifts, ships, grain enough to feed this world for 100 cycles. My clan council would have called the debt settled. But you didn't send gifts, Dane said. No. Her voice was quiet. But there was something underneath it. Something that had not been there in the language of gestures they'd once shared. Because neither of them had yet had the words for it. Among my people, the deepest life debts are not repaid with grain or gold. They are repaid with a life offered in return. I have come to offer you mine. Dane sat very still. Outside, the wind howled against the shelter's patched hulks. The same wind that had howled the night he'd found her freezing in the gulch below. You're saying, I am saying I have come to be your bride, Dane Ashworth of Hollow Ridge, if you will have me. Not because my council commands it, not because tradition demands it, though it does. I have led armies, I have ended wars, I have had 11 years to decide what I want, and in all that time, I have wanted nothing so much as I wanted to find the man who gave a starving stranger the last of what he had, and ask if he might still want her, now that she has something worth giving in return. For a long moment, Dane could not speak. He thought of 11 years of silveren hair and calloused hands, of a woman named Ilsa Rohn he had never quite let himself love, of a bone-white token worn hidden beneath his collar, through a decade of hunger and repair work and quiet, unspoken hope that had never once let itself be named. He reached beneath his collar and drew out the token, still strung on its worn cord, and held it out to her, the way he had once held out half a piece of bread. I never stopped wondering about you, he said. I told myself I was a fool for it. 11 years, and I never stopped. Threa Vask took the token from his hand, closing her clawed fingers gently around both it and his fingers together, the way she had once closed her hand around a stranger's bread on the coldest night of her life. Then we are both fools, she said, and I find I do not mind it at all. They were married within the season, in a ceremony that blended the customs of two peoples who had never before had reason to build a tradition together. Dane's neighbors from the dwindling colony standing alongside Vareth Shah, honor guards in gleaming ceremonial plates, ember-eyed and solemn, bearing witness to a debt not merely repaid but transformed into something neither species had a word for until now. Threa did not abandon her command. She could not, and Dane did not ask her to. But she brought resources to Hollow Ridge that the core world government never had. Grain convoys, medical supply runs, engineers to repair the failing terraforming grids that had doomed the colony from its very first season. Within 3 years, the gray and cracked soil of Hollow Ridge had begun slowly to green again. Dane never did leave the frontier world he had first come to as a broken promise of fertile land. He didn't need to. The woman he had once fed with the last of his own hunger had returned, years later, to make sure he never went hungry again. And in the giving and the returning, both of them had finally found the one thing neither war nor hardship had ever managed to starve out of them entirely. Hope, it turned out, could survive on half a piece of bread if you were patient enough to wait for it to grow.